We are now in the ninth question of Prima Secunda, the first part of the second part of the Summa. We're talking about the will and individual actions and how they connect to our final end and God. And again, this whole Summa really ties together so nicely. So I hope you're enjoying as we do this one day at a time. And this particular question has 6 articles, and it says basically of that which moves the will. Now, the will is the intellectual appetite. Okay, so we apprehend something with the intellect, and then we desire it with the will, as opposed to a sensitive desire like wanting a piece of pizza or sleep or a drink of beer or something like that. This is an intellectual appetite. So what moves it? How does it get moving in the first place? And again, 6 articles, starting with Article 1, whether the will is moved by the intellect. Now, this would make sense, and he's going to say, in essence, yeah, that's true, but it's not the only thing, right? A thing requires to be moved by something insofar as it is in potentiality to several things. For that which is in potentiality needs to be reduced to act by something actual. And to do this is to move. Now, a power of the soul is seen to be in potentiality to different things in 2 ways. First, with regard to acting or not acting. Okay, just the very act of doing something is the first part, right? Secondly, with regard to this or that action. Okay, once it decides to act, well, what is it going to do? Thus, the sight sometimes sees actually and sometimes sees not, and sometimes it sees white and sometimes black. It needs, therefore, a mover in 2 respects, that is, as to the exercise or use of the act and as to the determination of the act. The first of these is on the part of the subject. Okay, that's the one who's moving, like, for me and my will, I'm the subject, which is something acting, sometimes not acting, while the other is on the part of the object, by reason of which the act is specified. Okay, the object is the thing that the subject is interested in or is drawn to, right? The motion of the subject itself is due to some agent, and since every agent acts for an end, the principle of this motion lies in the end, and hence it is that the art which is concerned with the end by its command moves the art which is concerned with the means, just as the art of sailing commands the art of shipbuilding. Okay, so if you want to sail, you got to build a ship. Okay, so you see the end, and then you have to build something in order to do what you want to do. Now, good in general, which has the nature of an end, is the object of the will. Consequently, in this respect, the will moves the other powers of the soul to their acts, for we make use of the other powers when we will. For the end and perfection of every other power is included under the object of the will as some particular good. So the will is kind of like the boss, right? And all the other powers within the body are going to obey it once it commands or once it decides that it's going to, desire something, right? And always the art or power to which the universal end belongs moves to their acts the arts or powers to which belong the particular ends included in the universal end. On the other hand, the object moves by determining the act after the manner of a formal principle, whereby in natural things actions are specified as heating by heat. Now, the first formal principle is universal being and truth, which is the object of the intellect, and therefore by this kind of motion the intellect moves the will as presenting its object to it. Okay, so it's a long way to go to get to the fact that when you desire something, you first of all have to know what it is. All right, you have to know that it exists, and that's the act of the intellect, to know the being, and then the will desire it, or will desire it, right? Article 2, whether the will is moved by the sensitive appetite, okay, the things that we desire with our sensitive appetite, which would be something that we share with, brute animals. It's evident that according to a passion of the sensitive appetite, man is changed to a certain disposition. Wherefore, according as man is affected by a passion, something seems to him fitting, which does not seem when he is not so affected. Thus, it seems good to a man when he is angered, thus that seems good to a man when when angered, which did not seem good to him when he is calm. And in this way, the sensitive appetite moves the will on the part of the object. Okay, so yeah, obviously our sensitive appetite will draw us to something, and then the will sometimes will obey or not obey. Article 3, whether the will moves itself. How interesting. It belongs to the will to move the other powers by reason of the end, which is the will's object, as we already talked about. Now, the end is in things appetible, what the principle is in things intelligible. So again, he's comparing intellect and will here. But it's evident that the intellect, through its knowledge of the principle, reduces itself from potentiality to act as to its knowledge of conclusions, and thus it moves itself. Okay, so the intellect, in a sense, moves itself, right, by reducing from potentiality to act. And in like manner, the will, through its volition of the end, moves itself to will the means. Okay, that's kind of interesting. It seems kind of circular in a sense, doesn't it? Is the will moved by an exterior principle? Now, this lady is like, what does that mean? Because I had the same thought when I saw this question. As far as the will is moved by the object, it is evident that it can be moved by something exterior. But insofar as it is moved in the exercise of its act, we must again hold it to be moved by some exterior principle. For everything that is at one time an agent actually, and at another time an agent in potentiality, needs to be moved by a mover. Now it's evident that the will begins to will something, whereas previously it did not will it. Okay, that makes sense. Therefore, it must of necessity be moved by something to will it. And indeed, it moves itself, as was stated above, insofar as through willing the end, it reduces itself to the act of willing the means. Now, it cannot do this without the aid of counsel, for when a man wills to be healed, he begins to reflect how it can be attained, and through this reflection, he comes to the conclusion that he can be healed by a physician, and thus he wills it. But since he does not actually will to have health, he must of necessity, since he did not always will to have health, he must of necessity have begun through something moving him to will to be healed. And if the will moved itself to will this, it must of necessity have done this with the aid of counsel, following some previous volition. But this process could not go on to infinity. So it becomes like an infinite regress, you could say. Wherefore, we must of necessity suppose that the will advanced to its first movement in virtue of the instigation of some exterior mover, as Aristotle concludes in his chapter of Eudemian Ethics. Okay, now this one's interesting. Whether the will is moved by a heavenly body. All right, so the moon, and we know that there's an impact on us, the things out there in space, right? He says it's evident that the will can be moved by the heavenly bodies in the same way as it is moved by its object. That is to say, insofar as exterior bodies which move the will through being offered to the senses, and also the organs themselves of the sensitive powers, are subject to the movements of the heavenly bodies. Now, I'm just going to paraphrase this one for time's sake. He says that the immaterial moves the material, like our immaterial soul moves the material body, right? Angels can move things because they're immaterial, but a physical thing can't move an immaterial thing. And so he's saying that the heavenly bodies can't move the will directly, but they can influence the senses. They can influence the body, but not the will or the intellect, because the will and the intellect is incorporeal. All right, so that's, and let me see, I'll just read this last sentence. The intellectual appetite is moved in a fashion by the sensitive appetite, as we've already determined. The movements of the heavenly bodies have an indirect bearing on the will, insofar as the will happens to be moved by the passions of the sensitive appetite. Okay, so that makes sense. Finally, whether the will is moved by God alone as exterior principle. This one's pretty short. This is really interesting. He says the cause of the will can be none other than God. And this is evident for two reasons. First, because the will is a power of the rational soul, which is caused by God alone by creation. Okay, God created us. He gave us rational souls, and so He's the cause of it, right? Secondly, it is evident from the fact that the will is ordained to the universal good. Wherefore, nothing else can be the cause of the will except God himself, who is the universal good, while every other good is good by participation, and is some particular good and a particular cause does not give a universal inclination. That's really an important sentence there. I'm going to repeat that. A particular cause does not give a universal inclination. So overall, our will is basically for the good, and that we remember the third attribute of God was that he is goodness himself, right? All being and goodness are synonymous. Hence, neither can primary matter, which is potentiality to all forms, be created by some particular agent. All right, there was a lot there, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for joining me as we go through the Summa Theologia, one question at a time. Hope to see you tomorrow. God bless you.